This is another video that I've been wanting to make for a while, just talking about high and low cadence training, really. As someone who runs a very high cadence when racing and generally when training as well, but as someone who's wanting to experiment with doing low cadence work on the bike and has already experimented with that, but want to progress that further with my training approach for next year. First of all, look at the science. Go to Dylan Johnson's videos and see if there's any scientific basis behind low cadence training. And so far, there hasn't really been any studies that there's been studies into cadence training, but there hasn't been really any studies that show it as being efficacious as to improving your ability on the bike overall. However, it's pretty clear that just because there's no direct scientific studies behind it, well, it's widely used by World Tour teams. Like UAE is a more quoted team as utilizing high torque work, but I think it's utilized by probably most World Tour teams and done at some points during the season, at least start of the season, and then maybe at a maintenance level during the season. And kind of the thing that keeps me fascinated with the cadence stuff is at the end of the day, power is just a function of cadence and torque. Therefore, if we were isolating those variables to lock the cadence in at a certain value and try and work on the torque, that's more feasible than directly working on the power. We can't just force ourselves to produce more power for a given interval. But if we break it down into its constituent components and work on one rather than the other, that's a more realistic approach to the training. And if we can focus on the torque, for example, like focus on building up the torque and then reintroducing the cadence, could that result in more power on the bike and go faster as a result? I don't know, but it kind of makes sense to me as to breaking it down like that, and it could be effective for improving your ability. So and like I say, it's being widely used by World Tour teams, and if they're doing it, they've got some reasoning behind that, and so there's a good chance that it's actually effective. So I guess I've mainly been talking about low cadence work. So in the World Tour, low cadence is like a big thing. High cadence, not really so much. I mean, riders, I said right, World Tour riders are typically towards my end of running a higher cadence when they're actually competing, and therefore like doing high cadence drills is kind of unnecessary as the thing to work on is the lower end of being able to produce more torque, and struggling with producing higher cadence isn't going to be the issue really, as they're already able to. I'm assuming they're already able to produce the high end cadence, and therefore that's not the limiting variable for them. But if you look at track cyclists where they're running a fixed gear, so they're doing their whole event in the same gear, they need to they do high. I know they do high cadence work to be able to produce power at 140 RPM or whatever. Because the only way they have to they can't just ride a selected preferred cadence. Their only way to go faster is to pedal faster. They need to pedal faster, so they need to be able to have this really good range of cadence to do the start of the race, to get up to speed, producing extreme amounts of torque to do a track start. But then when they're going as fast as possible and to try and win that race, they need to pedal faster, and that's why they do high cadence work. But when we're outdoors, doing for most cyclists, we have derailleurs, so we can self-select which gear we want to be in for the given terrain, and it seems to be the case that working on the low cadence is maybe the thing to go on. And another thing that makes me think it's like there's nothing to lose from trying it is it's typically a stimulus that you want to do in the off season and the base season. So after taking your break off at the end of the year and building back up the training, this is like a nice alternative stimulus to include in the training, as it's definitely not as in, especially if you're regulating the time intensity, not going to be anywhere near as intense as the sessions you're doing leading up to your racing and alongside your racing. And it can I can see it combining really nicely with gym work, which is another thing that people should be prioritizing in the off season and the base season. So getting actually stronger, and combined with the low cadence work seems to be that seems to make sense to me, as to could be really beneficial. So I don't really see any downsides as to having a go at it, as it also keeps you keeps you focused on something else, of focused on doing these low cadence sessions rather than thinking, oh, I need to be doing some crazy hard session to prepare for the season. Like if you're doing a typical season, it's gonna be a long ass 6 month season. Like you don't want to be overcooking it too early, and therefore doing something different and easier earlier on in the year and keeping you focused on that, focus on your sprinting and your gym work instead. Uh, that can stop you from doing the fun stuff too early and burning out. So thinking about what like a preferred cadence is, there are studies. Lower cadence is widely known to be more mechanically efficient. So you're getting kind of, with each pedal stroke, you're getting more of that power is being transferred into the pedals and turning the bike at the lower cadence. I'd say lower cadence is more mechanically efficient, but also higher cadence is more metabolically efficient. That's just from the trend of what people say of higher cadence results in a higher heart rate, and you're producing less torque. It doesn't feel as aggressive on the legs because with each pedal stroke you're producing less. There's less torque. That's torque demand of that for the same power. It makes sense it being less mechanically efficient because if you're spinning at 110 rpm, there's going to be more dead spots in the pedal stroke where you're not actually producing, that power is being wasted where it's not going onto the pedals. Whereas at a lower cadence, there's constant tension on the pedals, and that's why I can see there being that higher mechanical efficiency. It also seems to be the case that cadence changes based off the effort in demand. So maybe this is just because we don't all have mountain bike gears on our bikes yet. Like there's still the trend into easier gears on road bikes, but we still have to look to our elders of running ridiculously compact chain rings for really steep stages. So uphill, people are generally running a lower cadence, and then for sprinting, this is you need to be running a higher cadence of 110 rpm or even higher, and that's part of that's having the snap to get away. But then if you also imagine a bunch sprint with 3 guys running side by side, I think if you're trying to produce 1500 watts at 50 rpm, you're going to be rocking the bike side to side so much, and it's not going to be as safe. There's not going to be that fluidity of kind of be able to bounce off each other. You can imagine if someone is sprinting at 120 rpm, they can kind of get knocked, and they're more likely to get back on top of that pedal stroke and be able to hold the bike up. Whereas if they're cycling at 50 rpm and they get knocked, their pedal stroke ain't doing anything to keep the bike upright. So yeah, I think it's safer to sprint at a higher RPM. It's just the way it is as well. But yeah, you do see that tend to see a lower cadence for uphills where it is more of a torque effort where you're like pushing against the resistance of the hill. So that's just something I've noticed. But what I've also thought about is like, is there a way of tracking this? So we have a power duration curve of you're producing your max power for a sprint, and then that drops off gradually and shows a nice curve down to what your 20-minute, your hour effort is. Should you see a similar trend in the cadence where we're sprinting at 140 rpm at our max cadence, and then that should just gradually come down? And if that cadence comes down, it kind of limits the torque demand of the higher efforts. So as you're going to shorter efforts that are higher power, you're increasing the cadence, and because you're producing more power, there's going to be more torque, a greater torque demand that comes with that. But if you're increasing the cadence alongside that, the torque demand is still going to be higher because of the jump in power you're producing. But because you're producing a higher cadence now, for like example for the sprinting, that increased torque demand isn't as great as it would be if you were doing the exact same cadence for all of your efforts from 20 minutes down to 20 seconds. So that's another idea of, do people just have a preferred cadence range of I was meant to put 110 rpm, probably tighter, to like doing 90 to 110 RPM for pretty much all their efforts, and then maybe for sprints they'd run a higher cadence, but for 1 hour efforts all the way to their 1 minute efforts, they're doing similar sort of cadence of 90 to 110 depending on how they're feeling, compared to maybe a curve where for a 20-minute effort they'd be doing it at 90 RPM, and for a 2-minute effort they'd be doing it at 120 RPM. And if you watch Dylan Johnson's video, like the summation of it is there's no scientific basis behind the high torque or the low cadence or high cadence training being effective, and therefore you should just train to your preferred cadence. And I definitely think this is the case during the season. When you're doing your hard training during the season, that should definitely be your preferred cadence. And however your preferred cadence is decided, if this makes sense of the it lining up with your power duration curve, or you just have a set preferred cadence, you should definitely be using that for your hardest efforts and just doing them to feel, really. But then there's kind of no downside to playing around with something new, like I said, in the base season, where you're trying these low cadence efforts. And when I did low cadence work last year, I was doing some high cadence work alongside that, as I was kind of a little bit worried that, if I'm just doing this low cadence work, is that what my body's going to be adapted to, and all I'm going to be able to do is lower cadence, when I know that for my max efforts I prefer to run a high cadence. So I was kind of doing some low torque high cadence work, just like one set at the end of the session, just to make sure I was keeping on top of it. But I think that's just a myth. That you're not gonna lose that high cadence, especially me. And I think if you can already produce that high cadence, as long as maybe if you only do low cadence work, so even your zone 2 rides, you're biasing them to a lower cadence, maybe you're going to lose the low cadence to an extent, but it's probably muscle memory where you can bounce back and relearn how to do the high cadence again. And I don't think there's many downsides to having a go at this in the off season, the base season. So even if there's no scientific basis behind it, you can try it, see if it works nicely for you, and it's a nice thing to experiment with. So yeah, I'm definitely planning on doing some more low cadence work in the new year, so end of 2024, 2025, and having a more sufficient block of it than I did last year. I was sort of focused with my training last year, and I targeted 70 Newton meters, which was based off what Jay Vine had said in a video that he'd done with talked about 50 RPM at 400 watts, which is like 76, 77 Newton meters. And I tried that sort of thing, but wasn't able to produce as much power, so I end up being slightly easier than that. 70 Newton meters tended to be what I was training to, and I built up to like 5x8 minutes, so pretty long efforts. Like Jay was saying, he was building up to a 10-minute effort. So yeah, I was doing like 370 watts at 50 RPM, and this was kind of like, I had the plan of what the torque Jay was doing, and I kind of wasn't as strong as him, so I ended up doing a bit lower. But I have got a plan to, so it wasn't super focused. But for next year, I can see benefits to my 30-second to 5-minute power coming from targeting a higher torque range. So 80 Newton meters to even 120 Newton meters. I don't know what that's going to feel like, but that's the plan, and we'll have a go at see if I can build up to that. But there'll be a lot more focus of trying to gradually stair step the torque to get to 100, because I'm not going to be able to do that linearly. That's going to take some time, and very much like a gym block, I'd say. And I really think it could pair nicely with the gym block stuff, as it seems like it would, high torque work not being the same as strength work. I feel like they could combine really nicely, where you're producing that higher torque, and it can line up with the torque that you're producing at the gym, even though the torque on the bike is still going to be a lot lower than you're going to be able to do in a hard set of squats. The theory behind the high torque work being effective is to do with the neuromuscular pathways. So I could see getting strong, and then you're rebuilding and building these new neuromuscular pathways from the new muscle you've got, and you're kind of directly transferring that work from the gym to the bike. That's the theory I've had in my head of of having that direct transfer. In powerlifting, there's a term strength as a skill, so there's a reason why there's lower weight classes that can lift ridiculous amounts of weights despite like not having a huge amount of muscle mass. Like the ability to lift a heavy weight isn't purely based on cross sectional area of your muscle. You can learn that strength as a skill, and a lot of that is through developing the neuromuscular pathways as to being extremely efficient with the movement that you're producing. And typically this is done for a 1 rep max in the squat, bench, or deadlift for powerlifting. But maybe you could, if you're utilizing, if you're doing the high torque work at the same time, your strength as a skill could be the torque that you're producing on the bike. So you're doing the gym work to get a bit of more muscle mass, and then the skill aspect that you're using that strength for is producing more torque through the bike rather than a 1 rep max in the deadlift. And I definitely think your gym work should tailor towards that strength end of the scale. Like 1 rep max is a bit far, and it's increasing the risk of injury. Really, is it's just inherently more stressful on the body. But moving to the lower rep ranges and trying to get actually stronger, but then also working on the high torque work at the same time, and trying to use that strength to something that's more beneficial on the bike. And it's not the same as doing an exercise that's trying to replicate, like doing a squat that's in the same motion as a pedal stroke. Like that stuff is known to just like not be as effective. Your gym work should be your classical gym exercises of your squat, your deadlift, your hip thrust. I can still see if you're doing that separate work on the bike that you could see that transfer being better. But this is just theory from my head, so it might be complete bullshit. But I'm gonna see if it works. So yeah. But overall, I think even though doing the low cadence work that I did last year, didn't see any crazy benefits from it. I didn't see any crazy improvement. I think there's no downside to giving a go at it, and it's something nice to experiment with. And there's a reason why the World Tour guys are doing it, so they definitely think it's effective. And who am I to argue with them? So yeah, definitely want to have another go at it myself this year, and yeah, like I say, have a more targeted approach and have a specific aim of why I'm doing it. And hopefully me getting stronger in the gym again is gonna coincide nicely with the with that training. And if you're a fan of Dylan Johnson, you know the gym work's the way to go. So you can at least get behind me on that regard, and maybe see the bridge as well.